let's talk about the 65th UN General Assembly meetings currently underway in New York, with the focus being on the deliverables of the Millennium Development Goals. I think everybody is of the consensus view that we're just not going to meet the targets.
Yeah, I think the meeting is important only because it's a stock-taking meeting. It's 5 years down the road. Are we meeting these goals, or are we not meeting them? And the picture is very mixed, that the rest of the developing world has done very well in meeting some of the goals. Africa is not going, in fact, to be any close to meeting these goals. So I think it's an important meeting for the world leaders to sit and debate, where do we go from here? Are we going to embarrass ourselves come 2015 when the rest, I mean, Africa's a big chunk of the developing world has not even come close.
The focus right now is on recovery post the credit crisis, and it's estimated that because of this global crisis, about 1/5 of international aid flows have dwindled in the world system. So there's less money available for it. What does that mean materially for the global poor?
You see, before the global crisis, actually, aid was already declining. The promises made by the industrialized countries were not actually being met. So it was just a confluence of bad events that you had the global financial crisis, the global energy crisis, but also the global food crisis, because this is really what has impacted Africa quite a lot. Like the Millennium Development Goals on food are not going to be met because people are hungrier now than before, because these countries are dependent on food imports. Aid is not coming in, and therefore the levels of investment are not as high as we expected them to be. And so the crisis is a confluence of various events around the financial, the food, and the energy crisis, just meaning that these countries are poorer than before the crisis. But I think my larger point is that even before the crisis, there was no aid coming. The G8 was making all these promises. There was no momentum on the trade issues, because trade is a very important component of these debates. These countries are not going to grow without trade. And you're not going to have trade when you have the stalemate at the Doha rounds. So all these are issues that there's a broader global stalemate on these issues.
I mean, obviously the heads of state are all making their various submissions and speeches, and the one who's spoken so far is the Chancellor of Germany, which is the third largest contributor to the UN budget overall, and they've already said Germany's not going to meet their targets for the MDGs. What does it mean when a big power like Germany says, we don't think we're going to meet our targets, we don't think we're going to be able to provide that 0.7% of our GDP towards aid? What does that mean for UN agencies like the World Health Organization or the Food and Agricultural Organization?
The simple story is belt tightening. Once there is a crisis in funding of UN agencies, the UN agencies have to look inward. They have to cut back on spending. Their bureaucracies sometimes are too huge. Sometimes they are spending resources on unnecessary things. I think it's a good opportunity, once there is a crisis, for these institutions essentially to begin to look inward and see how they can do well with fewer resources.
Meanwhile, others like Canada, which have also said that they don't think that they can meet their targets, have boosted their contribution towards issues like healthcare, for instance, this last year. Now, many people have the skeptical view that Canada's not doing it out of goodwill. They're doing it because they want a seat on the UN Security Council. To what extent do some of those political issues start to inform contributions to aid?
Aid is essentially a political process. So there are countries that would step up to the plate at some point to do good things, or to be seen to be doing good things. So that's why I think the Canadians have come up at this point when everybody is complaining about, where is the funding, where is the aid? And they have created, at least, they have come up and said, we're going to contribute. And this is a good thing. The French are also making their own noises. They're saying we need new programs, we need new initiatives to jumpstart the aid process. And so I would imagine that all these countries are actually playing that game for their own national interests. And I think we have to be realistic about that.
Lumkile Mondi, let me bring you into this conversation. Some people say aid is a business in itself, and a business that generates about $30 billion per annum. There is no incentive, irrespective of what's happened in the global credit crisis, to stop aid flows and to deal with issues of poverty, because it sustains an entire industry.
Well, the reality is that aid, in general, tends to prop up corrupt governments. We've seen in the rest of the continent, in the move towards openness, towards making sure that countries come up with the ERPM, the mechanism that we set up in terms of making sure that we can monitor the countries in terms of development, etc. And we've seen that a lot of governments have even come to the fore since some leadership changes happened in South Africa. We know President Begi, as well as Nigeria, the president also left. Since those presidents have left, the African Union has not really played its role in terms of making sure that the governance in the continent does take place. So at the moment, the aid out of this thing does not filter that much. It ends up making these governments not to take responsibility in leadership, leading that people out of poverty, that these countries need proper policies, they need leadership for them to come out. They can't rely on Europeans and countries for them to support, because charity starts at home. The leadership must take responsibility.
Professor Khadiagala, some are saying the fact that Africa has continued to grow steadily despite the credit crisis is an indication that something's being done correctly across the board, and that African leaders have started thinking outside the box. And it actually negates the argument for more aid from the UN or anywhere else.
Precisely, because the argument there is that if aid is not flowing from without, you have to look from within. And so there have been efforts at domestic resource mobilization. And everybody's talked about how can Africa actually do that? How can we do more in domestic resource mobilization so we avoid the aid dilemma?
Sure.
And so this crisis has been a good crisis for Africa in the sense that it forced some countries to begin to look at those alternative sources of financing. And this is where actually we should be going, because the MDGs are not going to be met if these economies are not growing. And these economies are not going to grow if they are dependent on aid or an infusion of money from without. So I think this is the ray of light in the crisis, is that it forces some debate about self-reliance.
But I think what is not done, unfortunately, Professor, is the intra-Africa trade. Because understanding that with the aid drying up, with the global crisis where our exports to our colonial masters has also come down, that we expect Africans to focus more on intra-African trade. And we're not seeing that at all. Instead, everyone is quiet about how we can improve that, given that on the world trade, Africa is about just under 2% of world trade.
Okay, you mentioned the trade agenda earlier on. It's a bit beyond the ambit of the UN, but it's something that the G20 has been trying to deal with. Africa's trade globally, or contribution to global trade, is less than 2%. But we've seen Africa's trade with the emerging market economies grow above 30%.
Yeah, that's a big point about South-South cooperation, or new linkages within the South-South framework, so that a lot of trade between Africa and China and India, and those are producing really good outcomes for some African countries, especially commodity producers. But overall, I think Africa's share of global trade is still going to remain at 2%, or even sometimes may decline. So there are rays of light in the emerging markets, and Africa being more innovative in the products it's actually selling to the rest of the world. But we also cannot forget the agenda of the broader WTO agenda of opening up markets for African products. I think that is an important element.
Okay, back to the UN, and finally, in terms of the innovations that could spur investment into a pro-poor agenda, into poverty alleviation, into education, healthcare, sanitation, the core functions of these Millennium Development Goals. France, you mentioned earlier on, together with Spain, they're calling for a tax on all business transactions that take place, similar to the bank tax that the G20 has put forward recently. How feasible a suggestion is that?
It's not a new idea. François Mitterrand, who was the president of France a few years ago, he made a proposal of an international tax, a tax on international travel. So I think the French perennially come up with these good sounding ideas that seem to, I think, mollify the critics of, where is French aid or where is Spanish aid? And I see it as a game not really, I don't see how banks are going to be taxed at this point. Banks are the least institutions that should be taxed, even on very good issues like development aid. But I suspect it's a misguided agenda.